Terrorism in Paris, France, by Valeria Lewis Gunn,
and Zachary Ross.
the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Next slide. On January 7th, 2015, several men entered the offices of the newspaper Charlie Hebdo and started shooting. The masked men killed 12 people and injured many more before leaving the offices on foot. The newspaper publishers of Charlie Hebdo explained that they were expecting some sort of response for their recent satirical work of the Prophet Muhammad, but never expected this response. 4 years ago, the newspaper was attacked with firebombs after depicting the Prophet in caricature on the cover of the newspaper. 3 years ago, the newspaper responded to the firebombs with more caricature, and the response from the Muslim world were in forms of demonstrations, protests, and altercations. Still, the newspaper's employees never expected this recent massacre. Next slide. And Zachary, you want to explain this?
Yeah, this video shows the actual shooting that happened in Paris at the Charlie Hebdo location.
Someone's screaming, "Lie down." Wow, he's leaving. God is great. Okay. Stay down, stay down, stay down.
So the video here shows the guys coming and going um, and screaming Allahu Akbar, which is God is great. Here's a photo of just showing just an example of the Muslims who were condemning the attack on Charlie Hebdo. And I'll let Valeria continue on.
So after the initial attack, Muslims came out and they were saying that they did not side with the violence. Of course, they were upset about the caricatures of their Prophet Muhammad on the cover of the newspaper, but they did not side with the recent violence. And these were a lot of Muslims who came out afterwards, really trying to silence the amount of anger that people were having against the Muslim world in general. They were trying to separate the Muslims who didn't appreciate the caricature but had the sense to not try to kill people, to the Muslims who were extremists and violent in nature. All right, since the January 7, 2015 shooting, religious violence has escalated in Paris. The percentage of physical violence against Muslims were doubled. 3 Parisian mosques were reported to have violent incidents, and in all, 15 religious attacks against Muslims were reported. So, since the January 7, 2015 shootings, violence against Muslims was just as prevalent as against Jews. Neither one condoning each other. So after January 7th, we started to see more violence against the Muslims as well as the Jews. That's the point I want to make here. The retaliatory violence continued, but this time it was against the Parisian Jews. On January 9th, 2015, 3 masked men entered a kosher market and began shooting. The Parisian police were on heightened alert and responded quickly to the incident. Before the violence was over, 3 people were dead, including 1 gunman. Can I get the next slide, please? After the Friday shooting, Parisians were ordered to stay inside their homes, and both mosques and synagogues were ordered closed. There was an outcry for justice by the French Jews, and the response were tweets from all over the world. Shehusha, I am Jewish. One other thing I want to mention here, I mentioned that the Parisian Jews were closed up in their homes. The Muslims who were not extremists, which were most of the Muslims in that in Paris, most of them were not extremists. They were also closed up. They didn't know what was going to come next. There are many ethical issues at play that led up to the terroristic attack in Paris on Wednesday, January 7, 2015. But the one that will be discussed here is related to the ethical responsibilities of the publishers, Charlie Hebdo Newspaper. Once violence was present, did a public newspaper provoke and or incite violence? Next. The publishers of the newspaper admittedly were very much aware of the insulting nature of the caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad. They continued publishing the material, 9 in all, in the face of the protesting Muslim world. The question becomes, why did the publishers continue to print material that they knew was causing a disturbing reaction from a particular population in the community? The answer is freedom of speech. So just to make this point here, when the newspaper started putting out these caricatures, it wasn't immediately responded from the Muslim community with violence. Immediately afterwards, people started sending notes and emails to the newspaper contesting the caricatures. It wasn't until later that violence started. When asked about the questionable decision to publish the last caricature cover of the Prophet Muhammad after witnessing the firebomb incident, the publisher cited the right for freedom of speech in the environment of ignorance. Next slide, please. France's Declaration of Rights came soon after the 1789 French Revolution, and it afforded the right to say, write, or print what you wanted, with noted exemptions found in the revised 1881 version, which included defamation, slander, and incitement to hate. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Incitement to hate. Incitement to hate. So is that what the publishers of Charlie Hebdo Newspaper did once they realized the violent reaction that a satirical caricature could provoke? No, says French President Francis Hollande. Charlie Hebdo's heroes had defended freedom of speech, and this was an attack on the entire republic, he says. Next slide, please. Many disagree with President Hollande and point to recent arrests due to the same freedom of speech by Muslim sympathizers. Once these sympathizers were arrested and accelerated trials were set, cries of double standards were heard from all around the world. Prime Minister Manuel Valls finally felt the need to make the distinction. Freedom of speech should not be confused with anti-Semitism, racism, and Holocaust denial. So after the January 7th and then after the January 9th incident, Muslims started coming out and started having their own caricatures, writing it on paper and disseminating it, and also going on television and on the radio and basically speaking against Charlie Hebdo, as well as the Jewish community, who felt like it was okay for Charlie Hebdo to go so far to talk about the Prophet Muhammad. But once the Muslims started coming out and started having basically freedom of speech in quotes, then they began to be arrested. One was put on trial, and he was arrested, say, on Monday. 2 weeks later, his trial started. So the people in the Muslim community there in France, they were outraged over that, and also the world lens was looking at Paris during this time and felt like there was a double standard going on there. Zachary, you want to explain this picture?
Yeah, so this one, it just shows sort of the accusations that the French Muslims made of the double standards that were going on in Paris and in France altogether at the time. And as you can show, there was a high presence of police and military forces at a lot of different Islamic sites, such as this one being described here at a mosque.
France's laws protecting freedom of speech is far more liberal than the USA, but in recent years it has scaled back its liberal ways. A law disallowing terrorism in the media has now included social media. At one point in 2007, an editor of Charlie Hebdo was brought up on charges on incitement after reprinting cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. So this caricature and this insulting environment was going on since 2007 and before. He was later cleared of all charges, but ethical questions regarding his behavior remain. He no longer works for the newspaper. Next slide, please. Whether it's believed that the publishers of Charlie Hebdo Newspaper were ethical in their behavior or not, what could be agreed upon is that the events that took place on January 7th as well as January 9th, 2015, have added to the conversation regarding freedom of speech, its ethical nature, and what are acceptable consequences. Are lives lost acceptable consequences for this freedom? Next slide.
So this cover of Charlie Hebdo was just an example, one example we draw it from, which shows a Jewish rabbi pushing an Islamic cleric, and it's just saying all the way to the mosque. So here is just some examples where it kind of touches on religious sensitivities of some of the ethnic minorities that exist in France. So I'll start talking here about some of the ideological issues uh, with Charlie Hebdo, with France, and with Muslims. So here, the situation is that Muslims who live in France have opposing ideologies of the nationals um, who sort of relate themselves to the French Revolution and freedoms there. So one of the fundamental issues of the Charlie Hebdo event is the ideological differences on both sides. For many Muslims who live under the rule of Islamic Shari'ah Law, um, Sharia law is the law of Islam, basically taken from the Quran and the Hadith, in which they recognize as a way to govern individuals. So in Sharia law, there's no recognizable authority but God, and no legal tradition but that of Islamic law. Most Muslims object to the universal character and indivisibility of human rights, which exists in France, as interpreted by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also known as UDHR, and find Western law, those particularly in Europe and the United States, incompatible with their belief system. So the United Nations, which France is a member of, and 193 countries in the world are a member of, has a charter, and their charter from 1945 acknowledges that the treatment of national citizens is not only a local issue, but an international one as well. And furthermore, the UDHR provides a standard of dignity and peace for all men, which is recognized by France since it is a UN member. So basically, this touches upon that a country cannot treat a certain minority group if they are nationals, if they are citizens. They have to be treated with a certain amount of dignity and respect. Also, if they are foreign and are not nationals. So two of the core international human rights treaties developed by the United Nations that relates to both sides, the French secular, um, which Charlie Hebdo and their authors and publishers were a part of, and the French Muslims, are the International Covenant Civil and Political Rights, which was drafted by the UN in 1966, and the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which was also drafted by the UN in 1966. So a method to address the situation with Charlie Hebdo and the Muslims in France is in regards to cultural factors and ethical codes. Freedom of speech should be clearly defined in France as what we think should be a methodology. They need to go back and look at what can be said without expressing and inciting hate towards a particular group, whether religious or ethnic, and should not allow for the inciting and violence, which is obvious with the behavior of the Charlie Hebdo newspapers and its publishers. Ethical codes in France should reflect the world of values and rights of all individuals. And there should be respect and limitations in what you can say and express if that's going to incite violence. So they need a revamping of the definition regarding freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is very loose, and everyone thinks that it means complete freedom. It does not, and it doesn't mean that really in any democratic state. And it has to include the reflection of the culture, religious, and ethnic diversity that exists in the constituency for which the code is made. So it has to reflect all of the different groups that exist in France, and not just support a particular ideology if you're able to say anything at any time, even though it's, it can be sensitive to a particular group and cause hatred. So in our conclusion here, I'm going to talk about although the world is becoming more diverse in terms of cultural, ethnic, and religious assimilation, which we see happening through transmigration all over the globe now, and now that a lot of countries are facing similar issues as Paris and as France altogether, where you see different ethnic and religious minorities coming to areas that never existed before. So this is just going to be a beginning stage, I think, of a long period of dealing with these sorts of issues. It's something that needs to be discussed at this point in time on an international level, particularly with the United Nations. So there are steep challenges that arise through this melting pot phenomenon, and all people should be treated with respect, dignity, and allowed to practice their beliefs and share in the freedom of expression through limitations that don't incite harm to its citizens. And I think we're going to go ahead and close off our presentation there. And just before we go, I'll just address a couple of interesting facts. There was a study released in 2013 by the European Jewish Congress and Tel Aviv University that find that highest number of anti-Semitic attacks reported that year had occurred in France, where Jews make about 1% of the population, but 40% of the victims of racist violence attacked. Secondly, Paris is one of the most cultured cities in Europe. Original Parisians are rare because most were born outside of the city. And as the 2010 census, there states 23% of the total population in the Paris area was born outside of metropolitan France. And lastly,
point I do want to make. Oh, I'm sorry, Zachary. Can I make just one point on that last screen?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'll let you wrap up.
The interesting fact, that first one, the study released in 2013. So basically, that's saying that out of the whole population there in France, the Jewish population is only 1%. But out of that 1%, they're only 1%, but out of all the violence that occurs in France, 40% of the violence is against the Jews, which is unrealistic. Should not be the case, and definitely explains why Jews are fleeing France. I think at some point, like Zachary said earlier, The representative from the Muslims as well as from the Jews need to sit down and come to some kind of understanding. Because if not, with this many Jews fleeing France, there's going to be an obvious gap in the culture of Paris. The beauty about Paris, and the second interesting facts accounts to that, is that it's a makeup of different ethnicities, different cultures, and that's why it's so metropolitan. And to have this group of people, the Jews, just fleeing because of violence, because of harassment, because of anti-Semitism, it's just sad. It's going to end up eventually just eating at the core of the Parisian soul. So again, I think at some point it would be nice if the UN could come in and mediate and find some kind of a resolution to what's going on over there. Here is a demographics of France. And it basically speaks to what I was talking about, the breakdown of the different ethnicities, whether it's religious or really these are the religious ethnicities. Roman Catholic 83 to 88%, Protestant 2%, Jews 1%, Muslims 5 to 10%, unaffiliated 4%. And it just really speaks to to Paris and France being a melting pot of culture. And that's what people love about France. That's what people love about Paris. And I would just hate to see that this violence just eats at the core of who they are. Anything else you want to say, Zachary?
I was just going to scroll through so they're able to see some of our references. And that is it. Well, we hope that you have enjoyed our presentation, and I've really enjoyed this course.